Chapter 32. As he watched Vengel hop down from the table, Garrett realized that his assessment hadn't been quite right. Rather than call Vengel a human-toad hybrid, the strange monster in front of him must have originally been a goblin. He moved with the same bent-legged squat waddle of the redcaps, and Garrett could see spiky red hair sticking up from the back of his neck. His mouth was filled with sharp goblin-like teeth, and a tongue long enough to wrap around his fat body multiple times extended from his mouth. His two bulging eyes peered at Garrett for a moment, and then he let out a hiss. "You are the one who killed Agmayoth," Vengel said. "You have not even absorbed his power, and you think yourself powerful enough to step into my lair and beat me? Preposterous." Spreading out his webbed fingers, Vengel gestured, and the slime in the 6 vats suddenly trembled before draining away. With every inch of slime that drained out of the tubes, Vengel's body began to swell, taking on a pus-colored sheen. Originally, he had been half of Garrett's height, but now, as he absorbed whatever was in the tubes, he grew rapidly until he towered over them. That fool Agmayoth only knew how to hide in the first tomb. He had no idea what it means to be a great ruler. But you've come just in time. I can teach you the lesson firsthand, giving you the honor of adding to my power. With another croaking laugh, Vengel launched himself forward, his massive pus-covered tongue sweeping out to slam into Sinan. With a shout, she focused her flame into her arms, blocking the tongue as best she could. Even as she did so, Jero launched herself forward, her swords hacking at Vengel's leg, and Isabel darted forward as well, her hair stabbing into Vengel's body, only to corrode as it touched the pus that covered him. Sinan's flames managed to block the majority of Vengel's attack, but the whipping tongue sent splatters of foul-smelling liquid every direction. Ducking to avoid a few drops, Garrett saw a big glob land on the ground next to him, immediately beginning to corrode the stone. The others were keeping the monstrous half-toad busy, so Garrett took a moment to study the corrosive energy, trying to understand what he was seeing. Rather than a liquid, it seemed to be similar to Liswick's flame, made of pure mental energy so thick it manifested itself as a physical substance. Hearing a grunt of pain, Garrett dove to the side as Sinan landed where he had been crouched. Though she bounced back up immediately, Garrett could see that she was favoring her side. She let out a growl as flame exploded around her and charged forward. Vengel attacked fiercely with his long tongue in his 2 arms, completely disregarding defense. Though that didn't seem to be a problem for him, as his body was entirely covered in the thick, yellowish pus that corroded everything it touched, making it almost impossible for Jero, Sinan, or Isabel to land effective attacks. Even when they coated their attacks with mental energy, it would be eaten away before they could deal any actual damage. The entire time, Vengel laughed madly, splattering his energy this way and that, and forcing his opponents to dodge out of the way. After observing for another moment, Garrett stood up and began working forward. Vengel saw him coming and opened his mouth wide, spitting a thick wad of pus-infused phlegm towards Garrett. His every movement casual, Garrett extended his umbrella and flicked his wrist, causing it to pop open and block the attack, which slid off as if it was nothing but harmless water. Garrett continued forward, even as his companions attacked, doing their best to keep the great ruler's attention. Madness flickered in his eyes as Vengel fought them off, trying to free himself up to deal with Garrett. That proved impossible, however, as he had to ward off Sinan's fiery fists, Isabel's swarming hair, and Jero's fierce blade attacks. "What are you gonna do?" he spat as Garrett got closer and closer. "I'm going to kill you," Garrett replied, his voice completely calm. Letting out a savage laugh, Vengel drove the 3 women back with a powerful blast of mental energy and pounced forward, intending to crush Garrett under his bulk. As his slime-covered body approached, Garrett found the mental energy shield he had pulled up around him was beginning to burn away, corroding faster than he could replenish it. But rather than panic, he simply remained in place, waiting as Vengel fell towards him. With a triumphant laugh, Vengel's huge, corrosive body slammed down on top of Garrett. But a moment later, that laugh turned into a terrible shriek, and Vengel's entire body collapsed, leaving his shivering, half-goblin, half-frog form hanging in the air. The corrosive energy that had surrounded him splashed to the ground, forming a giant puddle that quickly began to evaporate. As Vengel tried in vain to free himself from the knife protruding from his chest, Garrett watched Vengel dispassionately, keeping a tight grip on the handle of the Primordial's dagger. As the monster struggled, the dagger had cut straight through Vengel's thick mental energy, piercing directly into the monster's chest to land in the center of his heart. Any defense that Vengel could have mustered had vanished under the sharp edge of the toothed dagger. Lowering Vengel to the ground, Garrett abruptly withdrew the dagger from Vengel's heart, spun it around, and stabbed down again, sinking it through one of the monster's eyes and into his brain, cutting off whatever words Vengel was trying to gasp out. Vengel, rotting tongue of Wen has fallen. You have won a ruler's war. The territory of Vengel, rotting tongue of Wen, has been added to your territory, granting you control of the following areas: Sanitarium, Lower Nobles District, Lower Nobles Estates. A portion of Vengel's strength and memories have been granted to you, increasing your personal power. New options for growth have been unlocked. 136 experience gained during the Ruler's War. Current experience, 175/1280. Remaining crouched as he read the notifications. Garrett glanced down at Vengel's body, watching as it transformed into dust. A rush of information filled his head, containing scattered memories of Vengel's life, as well as information on Wen, the fallen god whose power Vengel had been trying to absorb. According to these memories, Wen was a god who controlled the domains of growth and decay, which explained both Vengel's rotting power and the incredible number of goblins scattered through this territory. You have successfully internalized much of Vengel's strength, granting you access to the power of Wen that the great ruler had plundered. You may select one of Vengel's skills. Rotting tongue. Your body naturally produces a thick, corrosive energy that can be used to harm others while healing yourself. Any mental power corroded by this energy will cause it to grow in volume and strength. Skill level 1. Without even thinking about it, Garrett rejected the rotting tongue ability. He had no desire to mimic Vengel and focus on the corrosive side of Wen's powers, or adopt the disgusting tongue that had been Vengel's signature look. Rather, what intrigued him was the next skill. Breath of Life. Channeling the power of Wen, your energy can increase the speed at which plants and creatures mature until they have arrived at the peak of their power. Skill level 1. No doubt this was the ability Vengel had used to rapidly replenish his forces, providing him with a never-ending stream of goblins. Goblins reproduced quickly as it was, but it still took them time to reach maturity, so Vengel had likely used his power to shorten this time frame. As Garrett focused on the Breath of Life ability, another window popped up in front of him. You have reached the maximum number of abilities you can possess. Please select which ability Breath of Life will replace. It only took Garrett a moment to choose to figure out which of his abilities he would be giving up in order to gain Breath of Life. A moment later, Dreamer's Cloak had been replaced with his new ability. Taking a deep breath, Garrett could feel the shift in the air, as the sanitarium and the surrounding territories came under his control. The faint stench began to fade, replaced with the familiar energy exuded by the Dreamer's Throne. Garrett wasn't the only one who felt it, and he saw Jero taking a deep breath as well, her eyes gleaming as she glanced at the dagger Garrett still clutched in his hand. Though she clearly wanted to ask about it, she didn't say anything, and they left the sanitarium to head back towards the surface. Having lost their ruler, the goblins began to scatter, fleeing as fast as they could into the darkness. There was plenty of time to hunt them down later, so Garrett commanded his forces not to chase, and sent Isabel to pick up Elrissa and her new legion of troops. The fight against the goblins had proven profitable for the necromancers, who had gathered hundreds of monster corpses that they would take back to use in their research. The awakened dreamers, who had been fighting for most of the night, were more than happy to let the goblins run, bringing the war to a close. The territory that Vengel had controlled, which now belonged to Garrett, butted up against Garrett's territory, with the low bridge connecting them. Since there were still a few hours till dawn, Garrett sent the awakened dreamers back toward Dreamer's Rest, following the path that the flower ghouls had taken. At the same time, he ordered the flower ghouls to move out and hunt the remaining goblins. He wasn't quite sure how the goblins had been brought into the dream, as they didn't have the strong mental energy inherent in the ghouls. He guessed that it had something to do with the breath of life ability. But there was time enough to experiment with that, and since he had no desire to add goblins to his forces, he ordered the flower ghouls not to spare a single one. The trolls, however, were a different story. Rather than attack them, the flower ghouls followed them silently, tracking them as the trolls retreated into the earth. It was nearly morning when Garrett made a surprising discovery. Beneath the noble district lay a dense warren of tunnels, all connected to a well-constructed defensive tunnel that ran up toward the gate. This was where the trolls and goblins resided, and if Garrett's guess was right, where they reproduced using nest stones. After ordering the flower ghouls to explore all of it while remaining hidden, Garrett felt the pull of the day and relaxed his mind, allowing himself to be drawn out of the dream. Taking a deep breath, he kept his eyes closed as he tried to process the surge of energy that filled his body and soul. Just like Lusric's flame, the breath of life ability carried a touch of one's power. Now, as it filled him, Garrett could feel his body shifting and changing. As his flesh struggled to suppress the explosive growth prompted by one's power, a hint of Lusric's flame threatened to burn him alive. Now, as his body squirmed, Garrett found himself fearing that he would suddenly sprout an extra arm. His encounter with Lusric's power had taught him that the power of the gods, whether deceased or not, was not something mortals were meant to toy with. On his own, he knew that it would corrupt him. However, Garrett had the ultimate cheat. As he focused his attention on his connection with the Dreamer's throne, a powerful aura began to spread, suppressing Wedden's power and integrating it into his body. Though the process only took a few minutes, to Garrett, it felt like an eternity. His body, completely soaked with sweat, felt as if it had been put through a wringer, with every inch of his bones crushed and reformed, every pound of his flesh torn apart and put back together. When he finally caught his gasping breath and sat up, Garrett found his body abnormally light. A moment later, he realized it was actually just that his strength had increased. With a faint feeling of disappointment, he discovered that he still couldn't move his legs, and despite the power of life that filled him, his wrist and hand were still missing. Garrett had been holding the faintest of hopes that absorbing the breath of life and Wen's power along with it would have restored his body to its original function, but it hadn't done anything of the sort. Taking a deep breath, Garrett buried the disappointment in his heart and called for Op through their connection. After Op had brought him some warm water and a washcloth, Garrett washed his body, removing all of the sweat that covered him. Then, after pulling himself from the tub, he dried off and got dressed. His power had never manifested itself in his physique, though as a shaper stage awakened, he was much stronger than a typical mortal. Now, however, his body appeared to have gone through another refinement, becoming like iron. Before, while he could certainly get around, it wasn't nearly as easy as it had suddenly become. Garrett found himself able to move his body almost effortlessly, and he idly wondered how his strength stacked up against other awakened. He had reached the top of the shaper level, and the next time he leveled up, he would be entering the manifesting stage. Unfortunately, he needed a lot of experience points to get there, and he had a suspicion that experience points would become harder and harder to come by, at least in the city. The one saving grace was that there were still two great rulers for him to send his forces against, which would practically guarantee his ascension into the 8th level, carrying him into the manifesting stage. His soul spark was practically perfect, and Wen's power that he had absorbed had added a spark of vitality to it that made the figure on the throne incredibly lifelike. Francis brought him some breakfast after he made his way to his office, and while he ate it, Garrett thumbed through various correspondence that had been sent to him. There were a few letters from various groups, including one from Caraway, giving a report of soap sales. Paro's attempt to steal their business had backfired spectacularly, completely ruining the brand associated with Paro's fine goods, and affecting not only their attempt to sell soap, but every other product that they produced. Ren's Royal Soap, on the other hand, had exploded in popularity, especially when those who had been inflicted with swamp rot found it helped heal the sores that covered their bodies. As for Pero himself, He was too busy defending himself from the corruption charges Commander Fernick was bringing against him and his shareholders to worry about trying to get revenge on Garrett. A small letter in a silver envelope caught Garrett's attention. It contained a simple card inviting him to a party to be held at Earl Bourne's house, and written in beautiful penmanship was a personalized note signed by Henrietta, hoping that he would attend. Chapter 33. After idly turning the invitation over, Garrett put it down and closed his eyes. He had no desire to marry Henrietta, or to make her think that he would. However, if he was going to continue to convince his father that he was on his side, it was necessary to at least feign interest. Weighing the pros and cons, Garrett finally decided to go, and penned a quick reply, sealing it in a simple envelope that bore the Klein family logo. There were still a few days before the party began, which Garrett intended to take full advantage of. Earl Bourne's estate happened to be in the new territory he had just seized from Vengel, which would help provide an extra layer of security if this was some sort of a trap. He had no reason to suspect it was, but thought it better to be safe than sorry. The next few days were quiet, at least for Garrett. He spent his waking hours taking care of the Klein family's business and organizing for the weapons and armor Victor had requested to be brought into the city. He also brought Rin out to look at a few businesses, including a large wholesale flour business. After a brief negotiation with the owner, he bought a large stake, becoming a silent partner. Once evening came and the sun set, Garrett sat on the Dreamer's throne, using its power to continue and refine the new energy in his body, until any hint of corruption had been removed. Once again, it set him back with regard to his soul spark, but the assurance that he wouldn't go crazy was well worth it. In addition to refining his soul spark using the power of the throne, Garrett focused on the new territory he had acquired, sending the flower ghouls to hunt down any goblins that remained on the surface, while also working to expand the network of dream flowers aggressively. Since he only had one Overmind flower, Garrett found it a little bit harder to control the dream flowers at a distance. But since he knew that with their new abilities, every dream flower planted would provide a significant increase in both his survivability and the power of his forces, Garrett didn't hold back, spending every single experience point he had gained in strategically placing dream flowers throughout his new territory. It was incredibly gratifying to watch as the flowers rapidly bloomed, and thanks to his new Breath of Life ability, each seed produced multiple blooms within only a few minutes. The more flowers that appeared in the new territory, the thinner the mist grew, and the easier it was for the awakened dreamers to navigate. Garrett issued repeatable missions in Dreamer's Rest, encouraging the awakened dreamers to take out teams to the new territory, clearing lingering nightmares, and encouraging the spread of the dream flowers. Anytime one of the dreamer teams needed to rest, all they had to do was go and find the nearest clump of dream flowers, which would instinctively use their new ranged attacks to infuse Lysric's life-giving flames into the tired dreamers. This allowed the dreamers to stay active longer, providing a positive cycle that caused their progress in the new district to snowball. By the morning of the party, Garrett was incredibly pleased with the state of his new territory and felt completely confident in entering it. Previously, any time he had left the area around Dreamer's Inn, it had been with a faint nervousness. But now, he felt like he was going for a stroll in his backyard. When the carriage pulled up that evening, he was completely calm. He had dressed in a fashionable, though muted, suit of dark fabric that contrasted with his pale skin. Rin was going to accompany him and wore a simple ball gown, with a filigree half-mask to cover the scar on her cheek. As the carriage carried them through the streets of the city, Garrett noticed that Rin's lips kept twitching, as if she was trying to suppress a smile. Raising his eyebrows, he caught her eye. "Something amusing?" "I was just thinking about you and your new sweetheart," Rin said, giggling when Garrett gave her a blank stare. "My what?" "Oh, you know, the noble lady who invited you to the ball." Despite her best efforts to suppress her laugh, Rin couldn't help it when she saw Garrett's face fall. "Don't be silly," Garrett said, turning his head and looking out the window. "Oh, come on, Garrett. A girl can hope." "Why are you so eager to marry me off?" Garrett asked. Rin didn't immediately reply, instead turning her attention to the beautiful houses they were beginning to pass by. Garrett didn't press her, giving her time to process her answer. "You know," she said finally, "I think people need balance." Unsure where this was going, Garrett's brow furrowed as he stared at Rin from across the carriage. Still not turning to face him, Rin's face was lit up by the passing lights. The silver mask she wore across one eye and one cheek, glimmering in the soft light. "If we live our whole lives with only what is cold and hard, we'll become cold and hard. Just like if we live our lives constantly surrounded by violence. It seeps its way into our souls, dyeing our whole lives in blood." "What about you?" Garrett asked. A wide smile spread across Rin's face as she turned to look at him. "I spent my life in darkness, and it's colored me through and through. But thanks to you, I have light." Lifting her hand, Rin's gaze dropped to her palm, where a pin showing the 5-petaled flower of the Klein family rested. It caught the light streaming in from the window, throwing rainbow-hued rays in all directions. "And it's a truly wondrous light." "I agree," Garrett said. "But like you, I too have this light. What makes you think I need something else?" Rin's smile slowly faded, and she put the badge away, her eyes meeting Garrett's, as the carriage came to a stop outside of the large mansion. "It's true that you have the Klein family," Rin said, "but you're in a different position than me, Garrett. You are the Klein family's king, or at least as close as we have, and every king needs a queen." Even if Rin had given Garrett a chance to respond, he wouldn't have known what to say. But as it was, she opened the door and got out, waiting for the driver to get Garrett's wheelchair down before helping him into it. In front of them was Earl Boren's large mansion, and a steady stream of well-dressed nobles were making their way in through the wide-open front door. It was an impressive building, 4 stories high and made of solid marble that gleamed in the warmth of the setting sun. Taking hold of Garrett's wheelchair, Rin pushed him forward to join the stream of people heading into the mansion. A few of the nobles looked over when they noticed Garrett and Rin's arrival, but apart from a few pleasant nods, they were otherwise ignored. Keeping her face impassive, Rin looked every bit the professional servant, while Garrett's calm, aloof expression marked him as little more than an indolent young nobleman. When it was their turn to enter, the steward, who was standing at the top of the stairs, saw them and, with a subtle gesture, sent 2 of the footmen down to assist in lifting Garrett up the stairs. "You must be Mr. Klein." One of them, "Yes," Garrett said, flashing a smile. The steward smiled and gestured for them to proceed inside. "Lady Henrietta is expecting you in the library. If you'll follow Benjamin here, he'll show you the way." "Thank you." Benjamin turned out to be one of the footmen who had helped Garrett up the stairs, and he led them back through the long hall that ran the length of the home, past the ballroom, where everybody else seemed to be gathering, to a small library, where he opened the door and announced Garrett. "Mr. Klein." There were 4 people in the room. Henrietta, 2 other young noblewomen, and a handsome young soldier. When they heard the door open, they all looked over, and Henrietta's eyes lit up. Rising to her feet, she hurried over to greet Garrett, as the others slowly got up as well. "Garrett, I'm so glad you came. Come, I'd like to introduce you to my friends." Tugging on his arm, Henrietta practically pulled them over to the couches where everyone had been sitting. "This is Olga, Charity, and Lieutenant Cobb." The lieutenant, about to stretch out a hand for a handshake, noticed Garrett's missing limb, and quickly turned his motion into a bow. "A pleasure to meet you, sir." Lieutenant Cobb had an open and frank air about him, and an easy smile that flashed through his eyes whenever his lips moved. "The pleasure is mine," Garrett said, bowing slightly in return. "Olga and Charity are 2 of my very best friends. Well, except for Princess Eloise, of course." Faking a look of anger, Olga rolled her pretty brown eyes. "Etta won't shut up about the fact that she got to see the princess before us." Seeing Henrietta stick out her tongue at her friend, Garrett was suddenly struck by the oddest feeling. If the events of the last 6 months hadn't taken place, if the attack against the royal family hadn't occurred, this is what his life would have looked like. He had just reached the age when it was customary to start attending balls, getting to know other young nobles, starting to build alliances as they looked for potential spouses. Instead, his world had been blown wide open. and he suddenly realized that he had very little in common with any of the children standing around him. I guess they're not really kids, as they're all the same age as I am. Well, why do I feel like they are? Henrietta tells me that you're a businessman in the Northern District. Garrett realized that Charity had addressed him, and with a calm smile, he nodded. I am. I've been developing a few different operations there over the last half a year. Were you there during the March of the Dead? Lieutenant Cobb asked, and when Garrett nodded, his eyes widened. Wow, that must have been tense. My unit was on standby right across the bridge, and once the alarm sounded, we joined the other units in moving out. It was bad enough coming in at the tail end of the fight. I can't imagine what it was like having participated directly. Shaking his head, Garrett lifted his arm to reveal his missing hand. I wouldn't say I participated directly. After all, my body's not very well suited for wrestling with zombies. Giggling, the girls all sat down as Henrietta took a chair next to Garrett, her hand resting lightly on his arm, until Olga gave her a knowing look. With a faint blush, Henrietta pulled her hand away and straightened her skirt. Garrett is being modest. His group participated directly in the defense, holding the southern wall of the graveyard alongside the Grave Walker gang. Surprised at the certainty in her voice, Garrett glanced over, but she didn't see the look as she continued to talk. They were so successful in their defense that there were no casualties among the civilians on that side of the graveyard. In fact, they even were able to support Commander Furnick and the city guard in holding the graveyard's gate. That must have been something, Lieutenant Cobb said, shaking his head. What a terrible night. Thankfully, it seems that the root cause has been dealt with, so it's unlikely that we will ever have to deal with another event like it. Well, I'm glad, Charity said. Can you imagine what would have happened if the zombies had gotten over the bridge? That would have been impossible, the lieutenant said with a smile. The defenses on the bridge are too strong. Besides, Garrett said softly, the army isn't to be underestimated, and once they moved out, the situation was cleaned up quickly. Seeing the girls looking at him with shining eyes, Lieutenant Cobb couldn't help but straighten his shoulders and lift his chin. Soon the topic turned to who would be attending the ball, and Garrett sat quietly as Rin stood behind him, as still as a post. According to the girls' gossip, most of the adults would be attending one of the small card parties, hosted by Earl Bourne and his wife. This party, mainly intended for the younger members of the nobility, seemed to be about getting a chance to be introduced to each other before the season officially started, which wouldn't happen for a few more weeks. Hearing them talk about the various eligible bachelors who were likely to show up, along with those they wished to avoid, Garrett quickly realized a couple of things. First, Charity and Lieutenant Cobb were in an unofficial relationship, no doubt hidden from her parents. He had been invited under the auspices of accompanying Olga, who was his cousin, but his real goal was to ward off potential suitors. Second, Henrietta had likely invited him for the same exact reason, intending to use him as a shield to keep other suitors at bay. That didn't bother Garrett at all, as he was likewise using her to ingratiate himself with Victor. After a little while, a servant entered the room and informed Henrietta that the food was about to be served, and it was time for her to make her appearance as hostess. With a sigh, she stood up. You know, I would much rather send everyone else home and just have a party with the five of us. 6, if you count Miss Rin, she said, giving Rin a soft smile. But, duty calls. Henrietta led the way out of the room, with Garrett following behind and Charity, Olga, and Lieutenant Cobb behind him. The Henrietta he had seen in the private library was fun and engaging, full of life and quick wit. But the closer to the party she got, the calmer and more regal her bearing became, until Garrett felt as if he was looking at an entirely different person as he watched her walk into the room to be announced. Not wanting to draw attention to himself, Garrett flicked a finger, erasing their presence from the minds of those around them, and had Rin slip into the room, parking at a table near the back. The room they were in was a dozen times larger than the library. A massive drawing room, with multiple fireplaces, huge windows that overlooked the lawn, and collections of expensive-looking couches scattered here and there. There were a few tables set up near the back of the room, with food being served nearby. No one was yet sitting down, so Garrett chose a table at random, and had Rin push him up to it. "Once our hostess is done with her speech, you can go get us some food," Garrett said, throwing a glance at the long tables piled high with delicious-looking morsels. Advertisement Chapter 34. Rin, who had been looking at the table ever since they came in, nodded, and when Henrietta had finished welcoming everybody to the party, and begun to make her rounds, greeting the various high-ranked nobles who were there, Rin hurried over to the food and began to pile 2 plates high. While she was dressed like a noblewoman, she didn't carry herself like one, and with a half-face mask to lend her an air of mystery, she drew more than a few glances. Most people were too polite to stare, however, and it wasn't long before she returned to the table to put a plate with about a dozen different things on it in front of Garrett. Raising his eyebrows, he looked up, only to see that Rin was holding 2 more plates, whose piles of food were towering even higher, threatening to fall all over the ground at any moment. Smiling cheerfully, she put the plates down, sat next to Garrett, and rubbed her hands as she got ready to dig in. "Use at least a little bit of elegance, please," Garrett said, but that just caused Rin to grin even wider. "I'm always elegant," she said, picking up some sort of stuffed pastry and shoving the whole thing in her mouth. Amused, Garrett picked up one of the forks by her plate and handed it to her, before selecting a fork for himself and beginning to pick through the pile of food in front of him. Just then, some music started, and everyone began to pull back from the center of the floor. A few of the braver young men and women moved out to the dance floor and began to show their graceful steps. Across the room, Garrett saw Henrietta looking around, no doubt for him, so he quickly put his head down and shoved a piece of cubed ham into his mouth. Unfortunately, he wasn't fast enough, and Henrietta, who must have felt his gaze, started heading in their direction. Feeling Rin's elbow nudging him, Garrett sighed and put his fork down, picking up the napkin to wipe his lips. He sincerely hoped that Henrietta wasn't going to come over and ask him to dance, and judging from the half a dozen dashing young men who were following after her as quickly as they could while still maintaining a sense of decorum, Garrett's hopes were likely to be dashed. Indeed, Henrietta called out to him as soon as she got close. "There you are. You slipped away and made me search all over the place to look for you, but it looks like you're enjoying the food, so that's good." "The food is quite good," Garrett said calmly. "Would you like to join us?" A hint of gratification flickered through Henrietta's eyes, but before she could respond, one of the young noblemen behind her caught up. "Lady Boron, I was hoping you'd do me the honor of this dance." Turning, Henrietta gave the young nobleman a sweet smile, but shook her head. "It's kind of you to invite me, Lord Von Ketter, but I was just about to sit down with Mr. Klein." The young nobleman seemed to notice Garrett and Rin for the first time, and his lips twitched into a quick frown. Quickly erasing his displeased expression, barely glanced at Garrett. "Mr. Klein? I'm not sure we've been introduced." Henrietta clearly didn't want to make the introduction, but she also didn't want to be impolite, and so she turned back toward Garrett. "Mr. Klein, this is Davis Von Ketter, son of Earl Von Ketter." "A pleasure," Garrett said softly, nodding to Davis. The young nobleman had been expecting a bigger reaction, and it was clear from the way he looked down his nose at Garrett that he was displeased. "Klein? Klein? I'm not sure that I've run across that name in the noble circles," Davis said. "Tell me, how are you and Lady Bourne acquainted?" Garrett's gaze flickered to Henrietta's, catching the hopeful look in her eyes. If he had to guess, this was likely the young man Henrietta was trying to avoid. Though Garrett was familiar with the various nobility in the city, he had never run across Davis in particular. However, he knew that the Von Ketter family wielded considerable political influence in the city. They also happened to be one of the staunch supporters of the previous royal family, meaning that they were likely on the princess's side. From the angry look that Davis was directing toward him, Garrett belatedly realized that he had just been pulled into a manufactured love triangle. He would have liked nothing more than to simply excuse himself and leave these noble children to their games. But he had already committed to playing the part, and so, with a soft smile, he nodded at Henrietta. My father is the regent's steward, and Henrietta and I will likely be engaged in the not-too-distant future." Because his words were so calm and matter-of-fact, they didn't quite register with Davis Von Ketter until a dozen seconds after Garrett had fallen silent. When they did, fury flashed across the young nobleman's face before rapidly disappearing, as he smiled widely. "My, this is the first that I'm hearing you are to be engaged, Lady Bourne. And to the son of the regent's steward, no less." Ignoring the hidden venom in Davis's words, Henrietta smiled widely, and walked over to Garrett's side, placing her hand on his shoulder. "It isn't common knowledge yet, so I'd appreciate it if you would keep it quiet until the official announcement is made." Though she said that, Henrietta had spoken in a loud enough voice that all of the nobles nearby, who were listening with half an ear, heard her admit it. Immediately conversation picked up, and the nearby nobles began to scatter. Within the hour, the news would be spread around the entire party, and likely far beyond. After all, there was little that the nobles liked more than a bit of juicy gossip. Slowly restraining his fury, Davis executed a short bow to Henrietta, completely ignoring Garrett. "Hopefully, I'll have the privilege of dancing with you another time," he said, before turning and stalking away. After he left, Henrietta's expression showed her worry. "I hope I haven't caused trouble for you," she said quietly, not daring to glance at Garrett. "Davis has a notoriously bad temper, and I'm afraid he might take out his anger on you." Picking up his fork, Garrett speared a slice of sausage. Before biting down on it, he glanced at Henrietta. "I have a policy," he said calmly, "to never stop someone who is digging their own grave." Not explaining his cryptic comment, he began to eat, keeping his focus on his food. Seeing Henrietta looking a bit lost, Rin pushed her second plate over in front of the young noblewoman. "You look hungry," she said. "The food's delicious." Rin hadn't stopped eating as the others were having their conversation, and since she was almost done with the food on her plate, she got up to get more. Word had already spread about Garrett and Henrietta's upcoming engagement, and throughout the evening, a few other nobles stopped to congratulate them. After staying for as long as was appropriate, Henrietta left Garrett's side to do her duty as hostess, and after she was gone, Lieutenant Cobb came over. "You're a braver man than I am," he said with a wry grin as he sat down across from Garrett. "Davis Von Ketter's got a nasty reputation, and connections with all sorts of dangerous types. He's even got connections with some gangs." "Which gangs?" Rin asked, her sharp tone causing the lieutenant to give her a long look. "It's a gang called the Moonlight Council, but they are not the really dangerous ones. Apparently, the strongest mercenary group in the entire city works as their underlings. They are called Rackham's Blade, and their leader is actually and awakened at the Shaper stage." Staring blankly at the young lieutenant for a moment, Rin blinked and then seemed to lose interest. "Oh," she remarked noncommittally before going back to her food. Taken aback by her less than excited response, Lieutenant Cobb turned his attention to Garrett. "I'm not just saying that. This has all been confirmed. Thank you for your consideration, Lieutenant. I'm sure I'll be just fine." Though he clearly didn't believe Garrett, the lieutenant didn't want to be a busybody. And after a few more minutes of small talk, he stood and left. Closing his eyes for a moment, Garrett suddenly smiled and pushed himself back from the table. "Let's say our goodbyes to our hostess. It's time to go." Looking up, Rin's gaze flickered across the room, taking in all of the nobles who were present. She saw Henrietta was chatting with a few young noblewomen near the door, but she broke away when she saw Garrett and Rin heading her direction. "Thank you so much for your invitation to the party," Garrett said. "We had a really good time." "Thank you so much for coming," Henrietta replied, "and I'm glad you enjoyed yourself. I hope to see you again soon." After making their way out of the ballroom and leaving the mansion, Garrett and Rin got into the carriage and began heading back toward the northern district. As he closed his eyes, Garrett could clearly sense the dream flowers scattered throughout this district, causing his lips to twitch into a smile once more. Across from him, Rin was lounged on the seat, all sense of decorum gone as she patted her full belly. "You know, you've been smiling a lot more than normal lately. I'm not going to lie, it's a little bit creepy." Erasing his smile, Garrett raised his eyebrow. "You shouldn't have eaten so much," he said. "We've got company for you to entertain." With a groan, Ren sat up. "You're right, that last plate was probably a mistake." Just then, the carriage halted, the driver letting out a low shout as he pulled the horses to a sharp stop, jolting the whole carriage. There was a thud and Garrett heard the driver groan, and a moment later the door was wrenched open and a few burly thugs stuck their head into the carriage. "Jump on out, our boss wants to talk to you." Seeing that Garrett had remained completely calm, Ren didn't immediately stab the man in the face, and instead, as Garrett gestured for her to get out, she sighed and held her skirt as she left the carriage. "Both of you need to get out," the thug said, shooting a glare at Garrett when he saw that he hadn't moved. "He can't walk, idiot," Ren said. "You have to get his wheelchair down." At first, the thug just stared at her blankly, not understanding what she had said. So she repeated herself, louder this time, and gestured towards the roof of the carriage where Garrett's wheelchair was strapped. "The wheelchair, you have to get it down so he can get out." Mumbling something under his breath, the thug climbed up onto the carriage and got the wheelchair down, though not without some difficulty, and then held it in place while Ren helped Garrett down from the carriage. She took her time, arranging a blanket around Garrett's legs, and then straightening his suit. The thug stood behind them, and though he wanted to protest, there was something that kept the words from coming out. Faintly unnerved, he took the first opportunity to relinquish the wheelchair to Ren. As Ren wheeled him forward, Garrett saw that the driver was lying on the ground, a gleaming crossbow bolt hovering near his chest. Standing in the middle of the road, in the most predictable manner possible, was Davis von Ketter, with two other young noblemen behind him. Davis was fairly tall, around 6'2", and wore a different coat than the one Garrett had seen him in only a few hours prior. He had changed into something darker, and from the rakish angle of the hat that sat on his head, he clearly thought he looked quite dashing. With a nasty smile, he stepped forward, his eyes raking over Garrett and Ren behind him. "I bet you never imagined your night would end like this," he said. "End like what?" Garrett replied, looking around. "You mean being stopped in the middle of the street and threatened?" "Yes. No, I definitely knew this was going to happen. As soon as I saw you, I could tell you were one of those small-minded people who imagine every circumstance that doesn't conform with their understanding of how the world should be as a personal slight. I've known a lot of people like you, and so it was easy to surmise the outcome of our encounter earlier this evening. What I am surprised about is that you managed to pull some of Rackham's blade into this mess." As Garrett finished speaking, his eyes flickered towards the side of the street, where three hardy-looking individuals loitered. He had spoken loudly enough for them to hear, and one of them, eyes narrowing, took a few steps forward. "You got something to say about Rackham's blade?" His voice was husky, and the scar that ran across the bridge of his nose and down one cheek made him look particularly savage. "I've plenty to say about Rackham's blade," Garrett replied. "But I don't know that I'd bother saying any of it to the likes of you." Davis, annoyed that Garrett was ignoring him, started to speak, but before he could, one of the other members of the mercenary group took up the conversation. "You're already in a dangerous situation, so why you feel the need to run your mouth and dig yourself deeper into a hole, I'm not quite sure. Unless you think the pretty lady with you is going to be sufficient to keep us from breaking your arms and leaving you face down in a gutter." "Was that the plan?" Garrett asked, his eyebrows arching. "To break my arms and leave me face down in a gutter? I imagine my father wouldn't be particularly happy about that." "Your father might be the steward to the regent," Davis said, eager to rejoin the conversation. "But his power is minuscule compared to the authority my family wields. Even if I killed you directly, there would be nothing he could do to me." "I think you might be surprised," Garrett replied calmly. "Victor Klein is not someone who should be underestimated. Believe me, I grew up with the man, and I know him well." Sneering, Davis was about to retort when the third member of Rackham's blade, who had been silent up until this point, interrupted. "Hold on, did you just say Klein? As in, the Klein family?" "I did say Klein," Garrett admitted. "But the Klein family has nothing to do with Victor, at least for the moment. Advertisement Chapter 35. Though he hadn't explicitly said it, the three mercenaries were quick enough to put two and two together. Stories of Garrett Klein and the Klein family's meteoric rise over the last few months had swept the city's underworld, and everyone knew that the Klein family's leader was confined to a wheelchair. Now, hearing that the young man in front of them, who fit that bill, also had the name Klein, made the three mercenaries quite nervous. If Garrett was who they thought he was, then their involvement in this affair would cause quite a mess. Swallowing, the one who had threatened to break Garrett's arms and leave him face down in the gutter, looked nervously at the other two and took a step back. Garrett, who was still ignoring Davis in favor of watching the three mercenaries, saw the move and smiled mirthlessly. "We've been having such a good conversation, though. Don't tell me you want to leave now." Though Garrett and Rin were alone, and neither of them was exuding any aura, the three mercenaries all felt their hearts drop. If nothing else, the absolute serenity Garrett was displaying was sign enough that they had delved into troubled waters. Before they could make their excuses and escape, however, Davis erupted. "Get him!" he snarled, and the squad of brutes he had brought along sprang into action, lunging for Garrett and Rin. Immediately, Rin sprang into action, darting to the right and landing a fierce punch on one of the men's faces. Though she was half his size, the blow sent him flying back through the air, his feet not touching the ground until he slammed into a post at the side of the road. Before anyone could blink, she was already on the other side of Garrett's wheelchair, planting a foot in another one of the thug's guts. Her speed was too fast for any of those watching to follow, including the three mercenaries, causing beads of sweat to break out on their brows as they watched her single-handedly thrash all six of the men who had charged towards Garrett. The fight was over in a few seconds, ending with Rin standing menacingly over the last of the thugs, who was moaning and holding his thigh, which she had snapped with a casual kick. Shooting Davis a disdainful glance, she slowly walked back to Garrett's wheelchair and took up her position behind it once more. The three mercenaries were more sure than ever that they had stumbled into a bee's nest, and each of them wished nothing more than to be as far away from here as possible. As for Davis, he was staring in absolute shock at Rin, unable to believe that she had so easily bested his men. A realization occurred to him, and with a shiver, he slowly stepped back, quickly looking toward the three mercenaries who he had hired. He had only brought them along in case Garrett happened to have an awakened protector. And as that had turned out to be exactly the case, he was now hoping that they would bail him out of the sticky situation he had gotten himself into. The three mercenaries wanted no part of it, and without a word, one of them pulled out a sack of coins, which he tossed at Davis's feet. The sack split as it hit the ground, gold rolling this way and that. "It's a refund," the mercenary said. "Double what you paid." Swallowing, he bowed to Garrett, and then turned and walked away, nearly breaking into a run a few times. The other two mercenaries cursed him under their breath, wishing that they had thought of that first. Glancing at each other, they quickly repeated the action, throwing more gold at Davis's feet before bowing to Garrett and escaping as fast as they could. Garrett and Rin were left alone in the middle of the street, with six groaning men lying on the ground around them, and one incredibly flustered nobleman frozen in front of them. Garrett and Rin both found the situation amusing. "Do you want me to go after them?" Rin asked, her eyes cold, as she stared into the darkness where the mercenaries had disappeared. "No need," Garrett said. "I'll talk to Rackham the next time I see him." Those words sent a shiver down Davis's spine. Up until this point, everything that had taken place had been utterly confusing, but now he was starting to realize that the mild-mannered individual in front of him was someone he never should have messed with. "What do you want to do with him?" Rin asked. "I could drop him in the river, and no one would be any the wiser." Those words caused Davis to tremble, and it was only with supreme effort that he managed to keep himself on his feet. After pausing far longer than the young nobleman liked, Garrett shook his head. "I've got a better idea," he said. To Davis, it appeared as if a strange five-petaled flower bloomed in Garrett's eyes, and a sense of dizziness overtook him, causing him to stumble. It passed in a moment, however, and when he stood up, he found he didn't feel any different than normal. "You know," Garrett said, watching the young nobleman, I don't know why it is that we can't be friends. I understand that you're interested in Henrietta. Is that right? Yes, Davis stammered, wondering if he had only imagined the sight of the flowers. Well, considering my pending engagement to Henrietta, it seems to me that you and I should get along. Davis wasn't quite sure how that made sense, but the more he thought about it the more it did. As you can see, Garrett continued, I have a considerable number of disadvantages, and so I could really use a strong and influential friend like you. Straightening up, Davis couldn't help but feel proud that Garrett had recognized his influence. I'm sure I'll have plenty of things that need to be taken care of, and being friends with the heir to the Von Ketter household is practically a dream come true. Garrett's words weren't sharp or forceful, but they seemed to worm their way into Davis' heart, and he found himself nodding along. You're right, he said. My apologies, I shouldn't have attacked you. No harm, no foul, Garrett said, ignoring the fact that the 6 thugs rolling around on the ground and moaning had certainly been harmed. I look forward to our continued friendship. As do I, Davis said, his eyes gleaming. A hazy thought tugged at his mind as he watched Garrett and Ren get back in the carriage and the driver climb up into the driver's seat, but it seemed to blow away in the night air before he could grasp it. Realizing that the thugs were blocking the way, Davis walked over and kicked one of them, commanding him to crawl to the side of the road, and then grabbed another and dragged him away himself. As he stood there, he saw Garrett wave from the window, and with a wide smile, he waved back, and then watched as the carriage vanished into the darkness. Huh, he's such a nice guy, Davis muttered to himself, completely oblivious to the ethereal blooms casting rainbow light above his head. I think we'll be good friends. As they crossed the lower bridge into the northern district, Ren glanced down at the dark river below. I still think you should have let me drop him in, she said. Allies are more useful than enemies, Garrett replied, and it'd be nice to have someone to ward off the rest of the trouble that's going to be coming my way from the noble circles. You think he can? Ren asked. I do. Don't look at his poor display this evening as an example of his power. His real power comes not from himself, but from his backing, Earl Von Ketter. If he had gotten his father involved, it wouldn't have been so simple as a bunch of thugs on a dark street. This was just a bit of childish petulance, and while we're used to dealing with strength on a different scale, mortals have their own advantages. Overall, I think it was a profitable night. And I think if you're not careful, you're gonna find yourself really marrying that girl. A valid observation, Garrett said, nodding. I'll make sure to clarify things with her soon. For the next few days, Garrett was on high alert. Planting dream seeds in Davis Von Ketter was a risk, as he didn't know whether Earl Von Ketter would have any way to tell his son had picked up uninvited guests. While the dream flowers were benign towards their house, at least on the surface, they still counted as a parasitic entity. And ever since Garrett had encountered the resistance from the mysterious artifacts worn by Dutchson and Veironi, the 2 merchants from Port Reverie, he had grown more cautious about who he infected. There didn't seem to be any movement, and when Garrett connected to the blooms Davis carried and used them to spy on the young nobleman, he didn't detect any danger. This was strange to him, and he was starting to wonder if there was something wrong with the city. The fact that so few individuals seemed to understand the threat of the dream world made Garrett wonder if there was someone actively suppressing information about it. The exorcists clearly knew about mysterious artifacts and could feel the intrusion of the dream, but even they were woefully unprepared to actually deal with it. Thanks to the many people who had been entering Dreamer's Rest, rumors had spread throughout the city of the mysterious dream world where it was possible to interact with others, but nobody had yet connected it to the source of the mysterious artifacts scattered throughout the world. Most of Garrett's days were spent issuing missions to the awakened dreamers, checking in on the Ebony Association as they began their comprehensive exploration of the swamp, and observing the development of the noble districts in the dream world. Since the number of experience points he needed to get to the next level was so high, Garrett thought it more efficient to completely solidify his control over his current territories. Moreover, the addition of a 3rd territory had given him another slot for a chosen, leaving him with 2 free. He had a couple of people in mind, but thought it better to wait and see how things developed before making his final selection. One morning, a few days after the party, through his network Garrett saw a royal carriage leave the palace, and a premonition struck him. Instead of going to his office first thing, he spent a bit more time getting dressed, donning his nicest suit. After that, he asked Rin to wear something nice, and then invited her to have breakfast. Sure enough, an hour and a half later, the royal carriage pulled up in front of DreamsThrone, and a dignified man with white hair and a trim mustache got out. Ignoring the people loitering around the entrance, he walked into the inn, quickly spotting Garrett and Rin. "Are you Garrett Klein?" he asked, walking over to where Garrett sat. Pushing himself back from the table, Garrett nodded. "I am. What can I do for you?" "My name is Kristoff, one of the butlers serving Her Majesty the Princess. If it's not too much of an imposition, she would like to invite you to meet her in the palace today." "It's not an imposition at all," Garrett said. "My schedule just so happens to be cleared." Looking around the room, Kristoff took in the way everyone else was dressed, and then looked back at Garrett and Rin, both of whom were wearing significantly nicer clothes, the sorts of clothes that one would see in the palace. Realizing that they were already ready for him, Kristoff was slightly confused, but still bowed and invited them out to the carriage. He wasn't quite sure how Rin was associated, and hesitated before allowing her to get in, but Garrett informed him that Rin was his attendant, gesturing to his unmoving legs as he did so. Relenting, Kristoff stepped out of the way and allowed her to seat herself next to Garrett. Once he had entered the carriage, the driver snapped the reins, and the horses started off. Though the carriage Garrett normally rode in was nice, this carriage was a step above, and they hardly felt a thing as they clattered over the cobblestones. The royal carriage was distinct, and no one dared stand in its way as it came down the street, so the trip to the palace was easy. Since Kristoff was sitting across from them, Rin didn't voice any of her questions. She had long since gotten used to Garrett and his mysterious ways of knowing everything before it happened, as well as his tendency to play his cards close to his chest, so given the circumstances she didn't bother saying anything aloud. When they arrived at the palace, the gates were opened, and they swept through, entering into the large front courtyard, before passing through a second gate into the inner courtyard, where a large statue of a regal-looking man stared down at them. As the carriage passed around it, Rin craned her head to the side, looking up at the former king's imposing visage. According to legend, this was the first king, the man who had established the city. The carriage came smoothly to a halt, and a moment later the door opened, and Kristoff got down. After Garrett and Rin had both alighted, Garrett looked over the palace. It was an imposing affair, and he could feel a faint field rejecting his mental energy. Even now, at this close range, he found it hard to connect to Princess Eloise, as if something was constantly interfering with the signal. He was curious to find out what would happen when he actually went inside, and a threat of nervousness grew in his chest as they got closer. The others didn't seem to be able to feel it, including Rin, who pushed him along while looking around in wide-eyed wonder. This was her first time in the palace, and Garrett's first time back since he had fallen from the bridge 6 months ago. When they got to the door, Garrett felt a popping sensation, almost as if he had walked into a bubble. At any moment he expected a wave of pressure to come crashing down on him, but instead he found that the inside of the palace had next to no inhibition to his mental energy. His connection with the dream flowers the princess carried, flared, and information began to rush into his mind. At the same time, his connection with all of the dream flowers outside the palace grew spotty, allowing Garrett to realize what was going on. Whatever was shielding the palace formed a barrier around it, but it didn't seem to have any effect inside. Furthermore, now that he was this close, Garrett could sense an odd haziness to the barrier, as if it wasn't operating at full strength. Chapter 36 Kristoff, who clearly had no idea they had just walked through a mental energy wall, brought Garrett and Rin to a waiting room and asked them to have a seat. Pulling Garrett up next to one of the chairs, Rin sat down, crossing one leg over the other, as she looked around with interest. The room they were in was lavishly decorated, with crimson and gold curtains covering the large square windows that overlooked the inner courtyard. Dozens of chairs lined the walls, and a pair of impassive guards stood like statues at one end of the room, guarding a door that no doubt led to the royal throne room. Though Garrett had never been in the waiting room, as he had spent most of his time in the palace following the young prince around, he was familiar with how this sort of thing worked. And when Rin started to get fidgety, after they had been waiting for half an hour, Garrett patted her and told her to calm down. Even as he did, he sent her a message through the flowers that connected them. "Do me a favor and go to the bathroom." Smelling a scheme, Rin perked up and got to her feet, walking over to the guards. "Excuse me, do you know where the bathroom is? All this waiting is making me nervous." The guard's expression didn't so much as twitch as he raised his hand and pointed to the hall. "Thank you," Rin said, practically bouncing as she left the room. There was an attendant outside who was soon able to direct her to the bathroom. After admiring the beautiful decor and the gold-plated fixtures, Rin washed her hands, waited for a few minutes, and then returned to the waiting room. Garrett was sitting there with his eyes closed, his body relaxed, almost as if asleep. Though she didn't know why Garrett had sent her out, she knew that he was up to something. Her intuition was spot on. As soon as she had left the room, Garrett had taken control of Isabel, who had been hiding in one of Rin's hairpins. Cautiously at first, just in case there was somebody or something monitoring the interior of the palace, Garrett controlled Isabel to bounce to one of the mirrors that dotted the palace's walls, and then to a gilt frame on a painting of a long-dead king. The entire time, he kept his senses on full alert, but there didn't seem to be any danger. So he grew bolder as he began to head towards the center of the palace. As far as Garrett could tell, the barrier that surrounded the palace had been produced by some sort of mysterious artifact. After thinking it through, he was fairly confident he knew where he would find it. As he explored the palace, continually moving lower until he reached the basement, Garrett kept half an eye on the waiting room, just in case they were called in. As he was about to enter the first level of the basement, Garrett heard the door open in the waiting room, and had Isabel lurk in a silver candelabra that was attached to the wall while he returned to his own body. As he opened his eyes, he saw a servant heading towards where he and Rin sat. "The princess is ready to see you now," the servant said. Leaving the waiting room, they walked down a long hall that curved along the side of the palace, and past a pair of large double doors that Garrett knew led into the throne room. At the end of the hall was a flight of stairs, and for a moment the servant paused, unsure what to do with Garrett, who was in a wheelchair. With a grin, Rin simply lifted him up, wheelchair and all, and they proceeded up to the second floor, Rin carrying Garrett in front of her. "Have you been gaining weight?" she muttered when she finally put him down. "I mean, it's not like you're heavy, but you certainly seem to be heavier than before." "I don't think so," Garrett replied, pinching the skin on his arm. "Then maybe I need to train more," she said. "I've been doing a lot of eating and sitting around lately." They followed the servant down another hallway, and stopped in front of a plain wooden door, which the servant knocked on. "Come in." The voice he heard was not the princess's, and exchanging a glance with Rin, Garrett steeled himself for the coming encounter. The door opened, and the servant stepped aside, gesturing for Rin and Garrett to enter. When they did, they found themselves in a comfortable library, larger than was typical, with half a dozen bookshelves arranged in one half of the room, and a large wooden desk in the other. There were a variety of chairs scattered around the room, and a large fireplace, with a cheerful fire dancing in it. The walls were covered in art, trophies, and weapons, each meticulously cared for. Princess Eloise sat in one of the two wing-back chairs nearest to the desk, while behind the desk sat the owner of the office, his piercing eyes fixed squarely on Garrett. "Welcome," Duke Arkoff said, his voice warm and rich. "Thank you so much for being willing to meet with us." "It is my honor, Your Highness," Garrett said, bowing at the waist. "None of that," Duke Arkoff said, waving his hand. "Come on, pull yourself up. And who is this young lady?" "This is my attendant, Rin," Garrett said, glancing back at Rin, who was practically frozen behind him. Garrett knew exactly how she was feeling, as he was feeling a lesser version of the same thing. The Duke's aura was almost completely contained, but despite that, There was a distinct sense of suppression that filled the room. The feeling was like nothing Garrett had ever felt before, and even as his body wanted to instinctively tremble, he could feel his soul spark flaring, sending out waves of power to combat the suppression. Rin wasn't so lucky. She was still in the lighting stage, and the Duke's nearly overwhelming strength was almost too much for her, clearly illustrating that the difference between a manifesting stage awakened and someone in the lighting stage was like the difference between heaven and earth. Had Duke Arkoff been forcefully expressing his aura, Garrett was almost positive that Rin wouldn't have been able to move, as even when he restrained it, she had trouble walking forward with steady steps. A flash of appreciation flickered through the Duke's gaze as he watched her push Garrett closer to the desk. Waving his hand, the Duke seemed to dismiss her, and nearly gasping for relief, she quickly backed up to stand by the door. Flashing his shark-like smile, Duke Arkoff looked at Garrett, carefully assessing him. Though he could still feel the intense pressure behind the Duke's stare, Garrett had an easier time of it as his soul spark stabilized. He had wondered if Duke Arkoff was actually in the manifesting stage, as rumors had circulated for years that he was. Now, the definite proof lay before him in the almost physical presence the Duke possessed. "Thank you for coming," Princess Eloise said, breaking the staring match between Garrett and her uncle. "And thank you, again, for allowing me to stay with you when I first entered the city." Shifting in his seat slightly, Garrett bowed towards the princess. "My pleasure, Your Highness. I'm glad that I could be of service." "We're hoping you can continue to be of service," the Duke said, watching Garrett carefully as he spoke. "But before we get into all of that, I'd love to know a little bit more about you. I must admit, I was taken aback when your name came up after the princess letter arrived. I hadn't anticipated Victor's son being so well connected." "I fear it's good fortune more than anything else," Garrett said modestly. "Unlikely," the Duke replied with a laugh. "Your father has served this kingdom well for years. His father before him, and his father before him. You follow in a line of highly competent individuals, and are proving yourself just as valuable. In fact, I find myself quite indebted to you, both for protecting Eloise and for your excellent counsel. She informed me that you were the one who encouraged her to write the letter to return to the palace. Tell me, when everyone else was encouraging the opposite, why did you tell her to return?" The Duke's piercing blue eyes seemed to cut a hole straight through Garrett, but he didn't grow nervous. Instead, with a small smile at the princess, he answered the question evenly. "Though I have never met your excellency before today, I've spent considerable time in the palace and know your reputation well. Rather than believe the rumors that you were the one behind the attack, I think it much more likely that your only involvement was in eliminating the assailants. Given your actions in the last few months since the attack, it struck me that you could have seized power quickly, completely cementing your control over the city. Instead, you've delayed, much to the chagrin of many of the nobles who were counting on being able to ride your coattails. Whether you knew the princess was alive or not, I'm not sure. But given your strength and the political support you currently enjoy, it struck me that if you wanted to be king, you could have been crowned almost immediately, and no one would have been able to protest. Since you've remained as regent, I came to the conclusion that you were waiting for someone, likely the princess. So rather than have her remain at the inn in a potentially dangerous situation, I thought it more appropriate for her to be here with you, where she would be guaranteed protection. After all, during the time that she was at the inn, we had more than one intruder, clearly out for blood. This was the first that the princess had heard of the nighttime attacks on the inn, and it caused her eyes to widen. What Garrett didn't say, of course, was that it had only been one group of 5 assassins, and they had actually been there for him, not for the princess. He had spoken frankly, not faltering once, even when Duke Arkoff's expression grew thunderous. And when the Duke let out a hearty chuckle, he knew he had made the right decision. "Well said. It's astounding to me that one so young could see so clearly. All of the fools who call themselves nobles in this city are blind in comparison. Their only thought is how to increase their own personal gain. Every single one of them, including those who should be the throne's most ardent supporters, like Count Galavin and Earl von Ketter, only pay lip service, while at the same time trying to pit me and my niece against each other. On more than one occasion, I have been tempted to grab my sword and cleanse their blight from this city. Thankfully, cooler heads have prevailed, Princess Eloise said, smiling cheekily as she looked at her uncle. Rolling his eyes, the Duke nodded. Still, I have to commend you. Thanks to your good advice, the princess is now safe. From what I understand, you're in contact with a number of the nobles who support the princess's ascension to the throne. Is that correct? Though Duke Arkoff had lost his grim look and was now smiling, Garrett wasn't fooled for a second. He knew that he was still being evaluated. The Duke was weighing his every word and action to try and determine if Garrett was a threat or not. Flashing a brief frown, Garrett nodded. Yes, I am. Though I must admit, Your Highness, I'm not particularly enchanted with them. It seems to me that they are more interested in what they can gain from the princess ascending the throne than from actually supporting her to the position. One of the most troubling things was the suggestion that the nobility have the opportunity to form a council, a sort of parliament, to vote on issues alongside the king. Catching Princess Eloise's curious look, Garrett continued to speak. As a means of testing the waters, I had suggested that the princess forward such a proposal when she talked to Baron Galavin, but the excitement in his eyes when he heard it was a bit too intense for my liking. And as the conversation continued, it became apparent that this was what the nobles were angling for all along, an increased say in the governance of the city. Indeed, Duke Arkoff said, leaning back in his chair, they've been talking to me about something like that as well. And what do you think? Is it a good idea? It could be, Garrett replied, as it would make the ruling of the city considerably easier, taking a tremendous amount of political pressure off of the royal family. At the same time, it would create a different set of problems. And though they are better problems, they would be problems nonetheless. Explain. Simply put, the political pressure that the king feels currently is grumbling and discontent. When the nobles don't like something, they have to find ways to subvert the laws. Inevitably, this creates complications for the ruler, as punishing the nobles too harshly is dangerous, but not punishing them for breaking the law simply emboldens them. Instead, if there were to be a parliament, discontent among the nobles would be funneled into political intrigue as they try to manipulate and guide the decisions of the parliament. Given that the royal family still would have the final deciding vote, as well as control over the military and the city guard, the nobles would have to play carefully. The result would be less effort spent in subverting the rules, and more effort spent in shaping the rules, or at least turning them to their own ends. At the same time, this creates a constant tug-of-war between the nobility and the royal family, as each vies for the ability to control the Senate. Duke Arkoff watched Garrett expressionlessly as he explained his thoughts, and when he had finished, the Duke leaned forward, resting his arms on his desk and steepling his fingers as he stared at Garrett. "You speak as if you have a solution," the Duke said, a hint of a smile on his face. "Do you?" Choosing his words carefully, Garrett gave a half shrug. "I wouldn't call it a solution, Your Highness, but I certainly know what I would do." "Do tell." "If I were the royal family, I would institute a council, but I wouldn't just invite the nobles. Instead, I would invite the most powerful merchants and the leaders of the other institutions in the city who wield power, whether overtly or covertly. Obviously, the nobles would have more seats than those other groups. Wouldn't that take much more effort to balance?" Duke Arkoff asked. Tope continued,